Hey everyone, we're at the University of Calgary for the second biennial meeting of the Pan-American Society for Evolutionary Developmental Biology. I'm Molly, I'm a graduate student in Elena Kramer's lab at Harvard University and the creator and host of Science in Real Life on YouTube. And I'm here with Mike Shapiro and we're going to talk all about what got him interested in the field of Evo-Devo.
I started out as a paleontologist in graduate school in the department that you're currently in fact. And after spending some time in paleontology, I became really interested not just in the patterns of diversity that we see in the fossil record, but also in the mechanisms that generate that diversity. And that wasn't as accessible as I would have liked in paleontology, so I turned to developmental biology to try to get at some of the mechanisms that are responsible for differences among and within different vertebrate groups.
Well, I was studying botany. I'm a botanist, and as an undergraduate and a master's student, I was really interested in floral diversity, and I was really approaching questions of diversity from a phylogenetic or evolutionary relationship sort of perspective. And right at that time, this really seminal paper came out, and it was about how flowers are patterned. What are the genes that pattern flower organ morphology? And some of you may know it, the ABC model of flower patterning. And I read that paper, and the idea that we could use that genetic model and sort of modify it or develop hypotheses from it to try and understand how all that diversity I was looking at, how that diversity was shaped, or at least some aspects of that diversity were shaped, that was just so intriguing to me. So then I sought out sort of that field of Evo-Devo.
Well, it's more, in my case, it's more like who got me interested in the field of Evo-Devo than what, because I came from a background of a master's in paleontology and geology when I started my PhD at McGill University. And my advisor was Hans Larsen, who also combines paleontological approaches with Evo-Devo and kept bringing up Evo-Devo in all sorts of contexts, which really fascinated me. And also my topic was on amphibians, which lend themselves really well for combining these two approaches. And this is what drew me into this field.
So, I guess I should say I wasn't aware of Evo-Devo as a field probably until graduate school. No one did it in my undergrad, although I was always interested in the diversity of flowers. Ever since I was a little kid, I loved to garden, I loved to collect wildflowers. And then when I was in graduate school, there were people who did phylogenetics. And the thought that you could learn about evolutionary history from genes, I was blown away by.
Totally.
And then once I started to put those pieces together, that we could have a phylogeny and learn how things are related and then how they changed over time, the obvious next question is, well, what happened? How did they change? How did new traits evolve? And so understanding that history, I think, is what Evo-Devo is all about.
Totally.
So I don't know if I was interested in Evo-Devo per se. I probably didn't even know what it was, because it seems like it's something that you don't encounter until a little bit later.
Totally.
But I've always been really interested in natural history. When I was a kid, I was running around collecting anything that I could find in the creek. We had a creek near the house, salamanders, insects, frogs, butterflies, those are insects, I know, but also looking at all the plants. I was always grabbing different flowers and bringing them home to my mom and expecting that she'd put them on the table, or climbing trees, and just appreciating the level of diversity that I saw in the world around me. And it never occurred to me that you could actually have a career studying that diversity. Much like you wouldn't think you could have a career climbing trees, but now you can, because you're climbing them to get to the top to understand what's going on with the flowers up there. So I think a lot of it was just sort of understanding that I wanted to work on diversity and realizing that there's processes to do that where you can see how the diversity of form develops in different lineages. And I was fortunate to have professors in college that saw that interest in my interest in natural history, and even though they didn't do that work, they gave me things to read that they thought would inspire me. And so reading some of that literature, I'm like, ooh, I want to do this. And that's how it happened.
So I was a PhD student starting in around 1999, and the human genome came out in 2000. And I was working in a zebrafish lab studying hindbrain development right after zebrafish became a new model system. So it was one of these emerging model systems we talk about now being weird and different. And the first paper that I submitted as a PhD student came back with reviews, and one of the reviewers said, if this is true in a mouse, which was the common model system, then you should study it in a mouse. And if it's not true in a mouse, then it's fish specific and uninterested.
No.
Yes. So I remember reading that review and I was thinking, I fundamentally, philosophically disagree with this statement. And then it got me thinking about the fact that actually what I, as a scientist, am more interested in is not as much all the things that make things the same as one another, but those things that make them different from one another. So I decided to do my postdoc with Cliff Tabin at Harvard primarily because I got interested in limbs because they're very different from one another. And his lab studies limbs, and he had an interest in Evo-Devo. And so we started looking for an animal to study. And that's how we came upon the jerboa, which is the system that my lab studies.
Mainly a naturalist as a kid. So I was a kid that went and got creepy crawly things. I was a kid that went and collected fossils. And so really it comes down to looking out in the natural world and wanting to understand how that happened.
Totally.
And that literally is the question that I would ask myself as a kid, and it's a question that I asked myself increasingly as I was going through my graduate training, and that was in the 90s, and Evo-Devo was still finding its feet. But increasingly I found myself, as I was chasing this question, I found myself in the field that ended up being, Evo-Devo, who we are now.
We'd love to know what first got you interested in Evo-Devo.
So I'm a very latecomer to Evo-Devo, to be honest. So I didn't train in it, but I work on something. So I'm a developmental biologist, and I work on something that actually has a very strong ecological relevance. And I kind of went from Devo to then Eco-Devo, and then Evo-Devo, because suddenly when you start talking about ecology, then you start thinking about many different kinds of plants in our case, and then it's the slippery slope to evolution and development. Now that I sort of got my toes in there, it's very cool in this field.
So I think there were 5 key elements. So when I was young, my dad used to cut out articles out of Science and other magazines. And he also got me books. He got me Gould's Bully for Brontosaurus, and of course Gould is very well known for being interested in Evo-Devo, and so I think I got my first introduction there. When I was a sophomore, I had 2 key events. I went to this talk by Elizabeth Verba, who's a paleontologist at Yale, and I really didn't understand much of the talk. But she showed these pictures. It was talking about heterochrony. She was mentioning all these words, heterochrony, and pedomorphosis, and all this stuff. I had no clue what she was talking about, but I really liked the talk, the ideas. So I wrote all the words down, and then I checked, the 2 books on heterochrony out of the library and read them. I also took I sat in on a graduate course given by Carl Liem, who was a fish ichthyologist, and he was on homeobox genes. So I got sort of that angle. And again, I didn't really understand a lot of it. And then the other 2 events was when I was a junior, I did a reading course with Richard Lewington. I was really fortunate, and he said, when I was a grad student, Dojanski thrust this book at me and said, read it. So here it is, you read it. And it was Factors of Evolution by Schmalhausen. It's a brilliant book. Old, not really out of date. And I also did a term paper where I learned, it was on, from molecules to morphology.
Yeah.
And I read about Waddington and Albert and Gale and Günter Wagner, who really influenced my thinking a lot. So, all those things, I knew I was set, no longer going to study evolutionary intelligence. I was going to do Evo-Devo.
Very cool.
So I joke with my students that I had to make up a whole field to do what I wanted to do. Because I was in ecology and evolution, going to graduate school for ecology and evolution, and I took developmental biology and I just fell in love with it. And I said, this is what I'm really interested in, because I was really interested in form and how form happened, but I didn't think you should be looking at adults. I think it's like you have to look at the embryo and figure out how the embryo develops. And so I was an early person to really talk about evolution and development. I had one of the first symposia it was then called the American Society of Zoology, and I had 10 speakers, and every one of them said, this is a really interesting symposium, but I don't think I fit into it. And so I thought, oh, well, maybe they only fit together in my mind, but it's wonderful to have a whole society now looking at these questions.
Couldn't agree more.